1274, the Japanese garrisons manning the islands just off the coast here and all the way to Tsushima, the big island between Korea and Japan, spotted a Mongol fleet on the horizon. Now the Mongols had taken over much of Asia and some areas outside of Asia, in Eastern Europe in particular, but they hadn't yet invaded Japan. Here they were, their fleet taking over island after island. The Japanese garrisons fought to the last man, something they do on some of these islands later in World War II. But at the end of the day, it was futile. The Mongols took over. The Mongols ultimately landed here at Hakata Bay, where they set up camp. And the Japanese did end up making battle with the Mongols several times, but it wasn't the Japanese, but the weather that ultimately convinced the Mongols to turn away. And the first invasion was over, and the Japanese had survived. Kublai Khan was busy anyway, the great Khan, whose forces these were. He was busy anyway taking over southern China, the southern Song. And he probably reasoned that if he could take all of China, there's no way Japan would then be able to stop him. All that naval power that would fall into his lap could be pointed at scrappy Japan. A second invasion was pretty much ensured when the Japanese government decided to execute 5 Mongol envoys to Japan. Now the Mongols had tried to send envoys before, for years actually. The first few were allowed to land in southwestern Japan, and then the next few weren't even allowed to land. These envoys were demanding Japanese submission to the Mongol Empire. Basically, become a vassal of us, the Mongols, or else. That's basically what these guys were saying. And then that first invasion happened. And now, these other envoys have arrived. They were allowed to land. They were marched across the country to Kamakura, which is just down the beach from where I am, just further down the beach, around the corner there. They were marched here, and the military government that was in charge decided to execute them and lopped off their heads. See, the Mongols had decided to invade at a very interesting time in Japanese history. This was the beginning of what could be called Japanese-style feudalism. This is going to last for 700 years. And that's when the Mongols invaded. And it was sort of unclear where power was. On paper, power is with the emperor. Of course, the imperial line preserved in Kyoto, the capital. This is the imperial capital. But as anyone who studies Japanese history knows, the emperor often, or usually, is not the one that's actually in charge. There's usually a power behind the throne that's pulling the strings. A great family, a courtesan family or whatever, the Fujiwaras. It just so happens that during this time, the Fujiwaras, they're sticking around. They're the true power in Kyoto, but they're not in charge of the government either. There's a different power in charge of the government. So it's not the emperor. It's not the ones pulling the strings behind the emperor. It's actually the military government here, the Bakufu. This is a shogunate that has recently been established, relatively speaking, about 100 years before. Shogun had been, as a previously existing title, it had been a sort of a temporary title for a general who was needed in a crisis or something, and then the title would be relinquished. Well, the title shogun had now been adopted as a permanent title, and in fact, the real power behind the throne was with the shogun, or at least theoretically it was with the shogun, the leader of the emperor's armies. In reality, the shogun was just the most powerful person in the land, but for legitimacy's sake, positioned himself as, the leader of the emperor's armies. But anyway, by the time the Mongols invaded, even the shoguns weren't the real power. It was a great family behind the shoguns, the Hojo family. And so you have this curious situation in Japan during the Kamakura period when the Mongols invaded. You have the Hojo family pulling the strings of the shogun, pulling the strings of the Fujiwaras, pulling the strings of the emperor. So it's no wonder that the Mongol envoys ultimately ended up not in Kyoto, but here in Kamakura. And in Kyoto, the imperial court was ready to negotiate with them, even submit, possibly. But not the military government here, not the Kamakura government, not the Bakufu. Those Mongol envoys were sent here, marched onto the beach behind me, which was an execution ground, and their heads were lopped off. They were beheaded. And you can actually still visit the graves of these Mongol envoys today. They're situated in a Nichiren temple, a Buddhist temple, just over there. You kill Mongol envoys, you're pretty much assuring wrathful vengeance from the Mongols. That tradition has now been very well established. You don't mess with Mongol envoys, because there will be a reckoning. And in this case, that reckoning came in the form of the largest overseas assault in history up to that point. Well, 7 years later, a second, much more massive army appears, and once again lands here in Hakata Bay. Now, this army had 150,000 troops. 150,000, to put that number into perspective, the Japanese, after years and years of preparation, are able to muster something like 40,000 troops. So 150,000. This could be the end of Japan. This is an existential threat that the Japanese are dealing with. But the Japanese are a little more prepared this time. One of the things they've been doing to prepare is they've been building a wall, a bulwark. And actually the wall went all around this bay, from that side of the bay all the way around to the other side. It's about 6 feet wide, 6 feet tall, it's made of stone, and it's able to prevent the Mongols from fighting the kind of, you know, in the way that they're best at. It requires a little bit of open space. So this wall does its job. But at the end of the day, it's not the wall, but it's the wind that wins the day for the Japanese. The Japanese emperor has been exhorting the people to pray. Pray in Shinto shrines, pray in Buddhist temples, pray for deliverance. And that's what they've been doing. And a couple months into the fighting, so the fighting does rage for a couple months, it's very bloody, it's very expensive, but a couple months into it, a massive typhoon develops and essentially destroys the Mongol fleet, takes it right out. And the Japanese go on to fight another day. Now, these divine winds are called kamikaze. Of course, that name will live on into the 20th and 21st centuries. But more important than the lasting name is a lasting idea. The idea, or the concept, that is cultivated by this Mongol defeat, that the Japanese islands are invulnerable. Okay? No foreign power is ever going to be able to take over them. They're invincible because they're protected by the gods. And this is important stuff, particularly in a World War II context. This is a myth or a concept that's going to live on all the way through 1945. So the Kamakura Bakufu is able to survive several more decades, probably due to its reputation as, you know, the government that successfully led a defense of Japan against, you know, the feared Mongols, the Mongol hordes. But when it comes down to it, the defense of Japan had been very expensive. Lots and lots of money had been expended, and nothing was won. There was no conquest, there were no lands, or there's no booty to be handed out or divvied out. There was very little that the Bakufu could do to compensate the soldiers who had fought and their leaders. What do you do? So at the end of the day, the Bakufu was dealing with a very large group of warriors who were very unhappy. Not to mention the fact that the government still has to pay for the defense of Japan, still has to continue to shore up the coastline, and who knows, another Mongol attack could be imminent. And so all of this comes together as a sort of perfect storm that brings the Bakufu down. And its leaders and their families all commit suicide, and power shifts back to Kyoto, back to the imperial court. So even though the Mongols did not successfully invade Japan, they were pushed back at the end of the day, their penchant for changing history holds true in Japan as well.